Hello and welcome to another episode of Spartalk. Today we're interrupting our series with Vincent to discuss Zohran Mamdani and the sort of political earthquake that has happened in New York recently. With me to break down what's what is Comrade Brianna joining me from New York. Hi, Brianna.
Hi.
So let's just get right to it. Give our listeners a sense of the political context, because obviously this is a big deal for New York, what's just happened, but things don't happen in a bubble. So there's, we've got Trump 2.0, there's things happening in the world. So could you just situate these primaries in kind of a broader context and why this became such a big deal?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple different layers to the context, but I would just start by saying really this Democratic Party primary just in New York City is a pretty important city for American capitalism, but it had a pretty big reach. And I think part of that was because it was a testing of basically two different paths that the Democrats can go. And so that's why it's gotten a lot of traction. One thing I would say is that the national context recently has been really tumultuous, and it's been changing a lot in a pretty short amount of time. Obviously, LA was going on with the massive protests and the ICE raids, and that is a big piece of context that informed the primary. In particular, the question of sanctuary cities and this old model of how Democratic Party cities are run. And the fears of Trump 2.0 were a big highlight that both debates of the primary focused on was basically how any prospective mayor would have been able to guide the party through that. Mm-hmm. And that was a big aspect. Another thing was obviously there's been a two-fronted assault by Trump. One was LA and another one was Iran. And the US having actually bombed nuclear sites in Iran, and the relatively little public movement around that, although a lot of people have been worried about war and about just in general escalating military presence that the US is going to take and what impact that would have on working people at home. So those are two big things.
Not to mention the genocide, of course, which...
the ongoing fact that, with the ceasefire, now Israel is able to focus even more on Gaza and the genocide there. So what the primary was basically Zohran Mamdani explicitly said that it was a referendum on the party and
on the Democratic Party.
Yeah, on where the Democratic Party would go. There's been a lot of damage control that the Democrats are aware that they need to do coming off the general election for president last year. And one of the big outcomes of that was obviously, Trump was getting a lot of support from the working class. And that was a big reason why the Democrats had to do damage control on Biden to Harris. But also now there's a bit of a competition, and I would even say in some ways a faction fight going on in the Democrats between the machine establishment politicians, who in this election, was really represented by Cuomo, and the progressive Bernie-inspired wing of the Democrats, here represented by Zohran Mamdani, and he was endorsed by Bernie and by AOC. Yeah, so I think the reason why there were a bunch of different candidates, but it really focused on these two. And the reason why is it's these two ways that the party could go. And we actually talked about this in an article in Workers' Vanguard, Where is the U.S. Going? Where we dealt with basically predicting that the Democratic Party, this machine, the establishment, and the way it was clinging onto the liberal status quo wasn't really going to play well with the working class who was moving to the right. And also the bourgeoisie increasingly also needs to distance itself from that. And so there was a wing, particularly, behind the Bernie Sanders, now tradition in the Democrats, of looking to a more social democratic policies. And so Zohran and his campaign was a big deal in that it was galvanizing people beyond those who normally tend to determine the primary, which is a pretty small section of the population. Retirees and relatively well-off middle-class people, homeowners, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I know a lot of celebs backed him.
Yes. So in particular was Kamala Harris's stepdaughter,
Jesus.
who lives in Bushwick. Zohran got a lot of support in Bushwick, pretty gentrified area of North Brooklyn. And he got a lot of support from influencers. He had he was very famous for his social media team, partially because he had a lot of influencer support. This is New York City. There's a lot of that.
Very effective social media game.
Yeah. And part of that was it kind of went to the sentiment that's been going on among like Democratic Party voters about, there's all of these old people. They're dinosaurs. They're irrelevant. People are like brain dead and still in office, like Dianne Feinstein. Yeah. So, there was like a real thing where they had a problem. And so Zoran's role has really been to rejuvenate this party that has been having a real, they've been having real problems. Trump is this very decisive force. He's very aggressive. He's very hostile, but he has that decisiveness that the Democrats have really been waffling. And part of why Zohran has gotten so much attention is he represents this path that the Democrats can now take to shore up. I mean, they want to shore up labor. They want to shore up the working class vote. But in terms of who actually is supporting Zohran and who he really got his support from, it was Bernie-inspired people.
They're Bernie-inspired people. As you're saying, younger, more like sort of progressive-y type Democrats? Yeah, so
Zohran is a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. And
just explain to our listeners who may not be familiar what that is.
Okay, yeah. So the DSA, right, Democratic Socialists of America, they're basically like a group. They call themselves socialists. And they've changed a lot, in particular since like 2016 and like Bernie's run for president. And so the DSA were very different before that. But really what defines the DSA today is that they're the largest leftist socialist ostensibly organization in the country. And they have a lot of members, and they, got huge amounts of youth coming off of Trump's election as president.
Mm-hmm.
The type of people that are active in the DSA or around the DSA, like pro-Palestinian activists. Right. There's AOC really was, she's a DSAer, and she was also part of that, recreating the DSA into a real force that can also try to pressure the Democrats to take on more social democratic policies. So yeah, the DSA is really really acts as a pressure group on the Democrats to enact more progressive policies and support progressive Democrats.
As you were explaining that, I mean, I could imagine our various leftist opponents just, going hysterical that like the Sparts are calling the DSA quote socialist. But anyways, we'll get to that, I'm sure, later. But for now, I think as you just summed it up there, the aim of the DSA is to put pressure on the Democratic Party, one of two wings of the American ruling class, to enact more progressive politics.
Yeah.
So Mamdani came up through the DSA.
Yeah, he's a DSAer. His politics are also kind of representative of like DSA politics.
Mm-hmm.
Even like a lefty DSA politics, like BDS, he's like a BDS supporter.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the things that has gotten him notoriety for being seen as like the pro-Palestinian candidate.
Mm-hmm.
DSAers were calling to support him on the basis of anti-Zionism. He's also he carries on in a certain way some of the traditions of the DSA. Like he is proposing this Department of Community Safety, which is supposed to basically have a separate team of like mental health, like educated people that would take care of like mental health crises and like homeless crises as opposed to the police. So he's kind of like getting some of the support from the police reform supporters in the DSA or just like young people in the city with that kind of proposal. I could just go through his platform. He's for...
Yeah, that would be useful.
Yeah, he's for a rent freeze. He's for what the rent freeze would be on, rent stabilized apartments. There would be he wants fast and free buses. He wants childcare, free childcare, and to like expand the hours that would be available. He wants to tax corporations that do business in New York and also the wealthiest New Yorkers to be able to accomplish these things. He wants to also have like a grocery store that's run by the city and every borough as kind of pressure on the grocery prices because they're pretty high, things like that.
I mean, these things sound good, right? Like cheaper. I mean, New York's crazy expensive.
It is. Oh my God.
Yeah, crazy expensive food, housing, everything. So that's okay. So you've laid out a little bit why this was really important. The Democrats are looking for what's their roadmap, what's their game plan. Your assertion is that, as Mamdani himself said, this is a referendum on the Democrats, and he's pushing this one particular kind of social democratic road. All right. And you've already been touching on, what his support base is, the Bernie supporters and the young liberals and so on. What we haven't so much talked about is the working class. New York is a union town. So talk about the working class. And it's also heavily, I mean, there's a huge Black population, Latinos, and also immigrant communities. And from where, my experience of the whole Mamdani situation was largely through social media and the news, but I know that he was able to make the rounds through some of the South Asian diaspora communities. Mm-hmm. I'm not really sure the appeal he had or the success he had, but let's talk a little bit about, outside of the progressive liberals and so on. Did he strike a chord with the actual working class people of New York?
From everything that I can see, the answers are really no. And there's been a pretty big distance between, Zohran and just like, Bernie supporting type people and like Democratic Party voters versus like the working class. Even, like a lot of the working class is, registered with the Democratic Party in the city like this. But he didn't particularly have that kind of effect on the working class. I think this is one of the interesting contradictions of his campaign is that it's oriented to the working class. He explicitly said he wants to lower the cost of living for working class New Yorkers. Mm-hmm. But this is an expression of the fact that the Democrats do need to reshore up their support in the unions, among workers, and that kind of thing. But who was actually really galvanized by his program and his politics and his proposals were college educated. A lot of them were white, higher paid people, like middle class, or, we would call like petty bourgeois people who were really the backbone of his campaign, the backbone of his volunteer corps and that kind of thing. And so in the working class, I think one of the factors there is the Democratic Party machine that does still exist in this city. They picked a different guy who's going to be their nominee this time, and it's not Cuomo, who really historically has that track record with the union leadership and with the establishment and Wall Street in general. But yeah, there was a real push by the union leadership to get people enthusiastic for Cuomo, and that didn't pan out. But it also didn't pan out that there was there wasn't really a resonance with Zohran. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of it is seen as very abstract, not really real proposals to solve the real problems that working people are facing. One thing I'll say is that there's big parts of the working class that work in the city but can't even afford to live here, and so wouldn't even necessarily be affected by proposals that are just for people who are able to live in certain parts of the city.
In the current issue of the paper, Workers' Vanguard, you guys have an article that 1199 Tops backed Cuomo, right?
Yeah.
1199 is one of the largest healthcare unions. Is that right?
Yeah, service employees.
Yeah, so 1199, quite a powerful union as I understand it. I guess my question, Zohran is saying these things that in theory ought to attract workers, right? Mm-hmm. Like cheaper things, cheaper groceries, et cetera, et cetera. But it's not really cutting much ice. And as you said, yeah, that's a bit of a contradiction. But why? Why is that? Why is there this gap?
I think part of it is that he and his role has really been taking on and trying to expand the political strategy of Bernie Sanders, or is kind of encapsulated in Bernie Sanders kind of era of Democratic Party politics. And so he's seen as okay, he's going to take on the establishment and things like that. But a lot of his proposals don't really resonate with the real feelings and experience of working class people. For instance, congestion pricing is pretty unpopular, especially because a lot of the working class, they live in New Jersey, they live in Pennsylvania even. Yeah, they live in other states sometimes even. Mm-hmm. And congestion pricing is one thing that is really unpopular among working class people in particular because, you can't afford to live in the city already. And then on top of that, you can't, your tax, to go to work.
Yeah, it's like a tax for being poor.
Yeah. So that's just one example of a particular thing that Zohran supports. But it's really also synonymous like with the progressive Democrats and just like the kind of shaming of working class people for not wanting to contribute to higher taxes so that there can be higher social spending, which in theory is supposed to give back to the working class. So that's one thing. Another thing is I think there has been like alienation over the question of like crime, public safety, that kind of thing. There is as much as like the police are often used against like Black, brown, working class people and, brutalize them, there is a real like, fear of crime and unsafety, and which in turn feeds a law and order sentiment,
Yeah,
you
for
know,
sure.
which of course is conservative in its way, but there's also a real problem. And someone like Zohran kind of toes this line where he's associated with like defunding the police, which Cuomo tried to use, and some other like Whitney Tilson, a right-wing guy, centrist Democrat who's also running for mayor in the primary, tried to use his policies around the police to kind of like drive a wedge between working class people and Zohran, because he doesn't really have a real answer to that. And it's also unpopular because of the real concerns people have. And there's no one who's actually trying to put forward like a viable alternative to relying on the police, which would be that the unions or the working class are taking up the defense of themselves and each other.
Right. I mean, in many ways, he's this like well-educated, upper petty bourgeois progressive by kind of that very nature. He's just like worlds apart from the actual experiences of normal people.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's as simple as it gets, but I don't know. Maybe I'm simplifying it too much.
Yeah. I mean, another thing I think is a dynamic, and this is New York City. This is like redlining. This is the city of intense segregation.
Sorry, what's redlining?
Redlining is just referring to the active, conscious, intentional policy of the landlords, the banks, the capitalist class in the United States, but particularly in big cities, to segregate and to enforce like, poverty among like, particularly like the Black community relative to like, white homeowners and that kind of thing. So this is a city where Black oppression does loom large, and the oppression of immigrants does loom large. And while Zohran is, himself an immigrant and Muslim, he would sometimes speak to these things. He really didn't have a pretense of offering much to like, Black people, or taking on segregation, or taking on these real and very inflammatory social questions that present themselves on like sharp racial lines. And so I think that was also quite alienating when you're talking about the working class of New York City. I mean, it is heavily Black, immigrant, Latino. These are things that you would need to take on if you're actually going to say like, I'm going to fight for quality housing. What does that mean if you're not taking on segregation?
Which means any kind of quality housing that's built, Black people are going to come last, right? That's the nature of the United States.
Yeah, or there's housing that's built in one area and housing that's built in another, and like, okay, they're building more affordable housing, but the one in the segregated Black neighborhood is going to be in so much more dilapidated and horrible state. And you need to deal with that. Actually, how would you fight for quality housing either way? And so as long as you have that situation of just the worse off, housing that's reserved for Black people, in particular in this city, how would you fight to improve at all when that acts as a downward pressure on the conditions that the whole working class experience?
Yeah, for sure. And I think linking this back to your earlier point about how the kind of prognosis we laid out in our earlier article, where is the United States going? For context, this was written after Trump was elected and there was all this crazy hysteria, but we tried to make sense of like, okay, these are the conditions that gave rise to Trump and the crisis of the Democratic Party, et cetera, et cetera. Our prognosis was, well, there's these two roads, and the road Mamdani is on is really this sort of populist orienting, to the working class, quote unquote, through just economic demands. Like if we're just saying good things for the workers, maybe they'll flock back to the Democratic Party. But when you're dealing with social questions as charged as they are, as the black question, you can't move an inch in American politics without dealing with that. Like it just falls flat. And I was just talking with a comrade earlier, he told me that Eric Adams, his recent press conference, Eric Adams is a current mayor of New York, his press conference, all black. Of course, there's optics involved, but the black mayor gets at the black people because he's able to play on the black question. And here you have this like liberal progressive who's like, oh no, we're just going to get all the good things, but it doesn't really strike a chord with people who experience a specific oppression in a specific way. And then they don't see this guy really speaking to them.
Yeah, I think that's a going to continue to be a big question, probably even more so now that a lot of what the general election is looking like it's going to play out is it's going to be, Zohran and his kind of colorblind economic populist program versus Eric Adams, who is really using the black church, black imagery, and tapping into the black establishment in order to regain support after he's really fallen from grace because of his being gone after by the federal government and things like that for corruption.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, I just wanted to ask, I was speaking with a friend of mine. He's in the Midwest somewhere, and I was like, hey, is the Mamdani stuff making its way over in the Midwest? We're not talking Chicago or whatever. We're talking about a small town. And he was like, no, nobody I know, none of my coworkers are talking about this because it's like really a bit of a New York thing, but also a huge liberal progressive left thing. New York is Wall Street, right? It's a heartbeat of the American empire. So of course this will have implications for national politics. But could you just talk a little bit about how this is being received nationally?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm in New York and I've always been from this city. So I have a particular view here. And one thing about New York I will say is New York really is two almost mutually exclusive cities. There is Wall Street and there's money and there's the big landlords and there's that, which is the heart of why New York exists the way it does. And then there's also the working class, the Black and immigrant, particularly Latino, Asian immigrants. And they can be very separate and it can be jarring. And I think in that sense, that is not so different from other New York cities. Other American cities where those racial dynamics are a big way that politics play out. And so I'm sure in big cities, in particular cities with a larger middle class, college educated professionals, and with a DSA presence, someone like Mamdani is going to have more of he's going to be used as a political example of a new orientation to pressure the Democrats to take.
Right.
Then there's other parts of the country, and a lot of this country most of this country does not look like New York, right? And it really does not. And in other places like rural or suburban or just small towns, I mean, someone like Mamdani and what he has to offer is not something that really speaks to the needs, or his strategy wouldn't even begin to deal with the polarizations and the problems that working people experience in those places.
If anything, I feel like it's just going to drive people more towards the arms of Trump and polarize the country more along the lines of liberals in the big cities versus the Trump space, so-called.
One of the problems, this strategy of this guy who is his role and his intention is to build up the Democrats again, to make them reorient them into a more a political force that has more power behind it, right? For the wing of the capitalist class that's organized behind the Democrats. What he has to offer is, inherently limited by that whole strategy and the fact that, his intention is to build up this party again. Yeah. And so his methods, reflect that, and also the limitations of those methods. And, it in ways that don't really, speak to the real needs that working people have.
Okay, so let's cut to the chase. We've been talking about the context of these primaries, what Mamdani represents, et cetera, et cetera. But if you could give our listeners a concise sort of explanation, why is this not a step forward for New York?
Yeah. Well, one thing I do want to talk about is how Zohran's methods are fundamentally limited by the role that he's playing for the capitalist class, right? How do you solve the cost of living crisis is really what's posed at every point. You do need to take on the big landlords, one of the main drivers of the insane cost of living in this city and just like in general. You need to take on the MTA if you're going to fight for quality public transportation. He's talking about buses. That's
a
good.
transit authority, metropolitan transit. Yeah, okay.
And so, he's talking about free quality buses, and that would be awesome to have that. One thing is, the majority of working people, like, you don't use the buses to get around, really. It's the subways that are dilapidated, that are over 100 years old since they've seen any improvement. This is really
They
like
have
outdated.
gigantic rats in them.
Yeah, this is outdated, rotting technology. And if there is improvements, it's on lines that are close to gentrified properties. So, again, tied to the question of real estate developers and big landlords. When you're talking about the questions of childcare, you're talking about the condition of women and working women. If you're going to fight for that, you actually do need to take up yes, like the working class has an interest in fighting for this and for social spending that they will also benefit from. And to do that, it has to be at the cost of, like the big capitalists, not out of, their own pockets, because that feeds, again, division. Like at every point in his program and what he's attempting to do, he's explicitly, not trying to go against the big landlords, trying to prepare the working people to embark on such a fight, right? It's, changing the tax rate, taxing the people who do business in the city or things like that, but also direct taxes on the working class, like congestion pricing is one example. And so this isn't like a thing that's a frontal attack on the ruling class at all. In fact, what it is, right, it's like, let's make this party of Wall Street big landlords look more appealing to working people. But what that also means is you will never attack the real core of, the cost of living crisis, right? Which is just an outgrowth of just like the parasitism of this ruling class. And so I think at every point, like he is not actually trying to guide the working people to do anything. He's a capitalist politician who's very clear that he wants to remake the Democrats into something that's more palatable to working people, but in no way is like going to be an instrument to fight against the ruling class.
Okay. So I think that's actually a useful segue to start talking about the left, because there's many shades within the left in terms of their take on Mamdani. As you were speaking, I could already anticipate certain leftists or DSAers disagreeing because they were like, well, it's a tiny step forward, right? You can still fight for reforms by doing this or that or the other thing, whatever. So let's start to maybe see, like, what's the lay of the land of the left? How did the left react to this? Because again, it's useful to keep in mind that these things happen in a context where the left, it has been on the back foot. There's a huge shift to the right in the country, which again is unfortunately a controversial point in the left. I was reading the press of the RCA, that's the Revolutionary Communists of America, who explicitly state that this really shows how there isn't a shift to the right. In fact, it shows that there's a shift to the left. Like, I mean, it's a sad state of affairs when you've got, commander-in-chief of U.S. imperialism letting it loose on immigrants throughout the country, sending in the Marines in LA, bombing the shit out of another country, and they don't think that the working class, anyways, I'll stop with that. But what's my question? My question is, what's the lay of the land of the left, and what's the various sort of gradations of the support or criticism for Mamdani?
Well, there's a different dynamic based off what groups we're talking about. The general gist is like there's kind of this debate that's been going on the left, in particular around, Mamdani, around the question of like, are we going to be inside the movement and we're going to try to get our guys, quote unquote, into the Democrats to fight for good things, right? That's the perspective of the DSA, is to use the Democratic Party as like a vehicle to get progressive policies enacted and support progressive politicians. And then, for some to eventually break away and build a workers' party. And then there's the outsiders who are debating, well, we will be more effective if we are outside of the Democrats, but nonetheless, the movement around Zohran, they say, is actually, has a revolutionary and like anti-capitalist potential. So those are the two kind of polls. And so I guess I'll start with the DSA because, Zohran is a DSAer. And, what's really going on with the DSA is that their role is to try to, kind of along the lines of what Zohran's doing, like reorient and reposition the Democrats along the lines of FDR and the New Deal. Right. So like more social spending, more crumbs to give to workers. And this was their argument coming off of, Kamala Harris losing to Trump, was that they needed to go back to the New Deal in order to win back working class constituencies that have been looking to the right. And so, yeah, that's, Zohran is for them Zohran is like really their guy. So I would just say the real question for the DSA is like how to fight to actually defend working people against the cost of living crisis requires at every point like mobilizing and organizing against the capitalist class. But what has the role of New Deal style Democrats been, from Bernie Sanders all the way to FDR, has always been to stop the working class from, and youth and activists and other, parts of the population, including struggling parts of the middle class, from breaking away from the Democratic Party, from breaking away from, a party that is dominated by the capitalist class. And in order to head off potential social explosions, we saw it, we've already seen it a little bit, right, with Los Angeles. There was a real social tinder, and it's very important, if the Democrats are going to maintain their political usefulness, that they are able to corral that back into the confines of their party. And so the role of the DSA in supporting Zohran is really like to help him do that. But in reality, right, they are also alienating, I think, further the working class from any associations with socialism, because there's an association of socialism with liberal politics, with the Democratic Party that has, presided over the 2008 financial crisis and the bailing out of the banks under Obama. There's just an association with guilt tripping and moralism directed against workers, in particular white workers, but also all sorts of wings of the working class who voted for Trump, a lot of which were Latino. There were also, a sizable amount of Black working class voters, immigrants, like a lot of immigrants who themselves are now like under attack, look to him. And so what the DSA is doing is actually like deepening this divide between the left and the working class. That way, really only juicing up Donald Trump's credentials and giving him an audience. So,
what about the far left?
Yeah. So then that's really more people who are like not organizationally inside the Democrats or, electing people into the Democratic Party, but groups like Socialist Alternative, Left Voice, and the Revolutionary Communists of America, who you mentioned. And so their role is, they argue quite differently. Sometimes you'd be like, is this different? But they do argue more for their need for there to be a movement outside of the Democratic Party, right? And so they make like useful points about how the Democratic Party is like where social movements go to die and things like that. I was like, yes, this is a good point. The question is like the political logic and the conclusions you draw from that, I think. And so from these leftists, in the far left who position themselves as like outsiders, right, that they don't want to support Democratic Party politicians, what they do is really build up Zohran's credentials, attribute to him like radical politics, and in particular to his supporters, and attributing his supporters like that they have radical anti-capitalist politics because they are supporting him. So it's like a backhanded way of saying like, Zohran is a radical and a socialist who should be supported, but just like, oh, maybe if he wasn't in the Democrats, then we could support him. So that's explicit for, like a couple groups that you have, Socialist Alternative, who explicitly said that, they wanted Zohran to run as an independent socialist. Then you have Left Voice, who was a little different, but kind of fell into the same category, where they really said, the movement around Zohran was anti-capitalist, but that he was inhibited by being in the Democrats. So it's like attributing to him like an anti-capitalist perspective and strategy and program through like his supporters, and basically saying if he left, then he could like make good on this and be a supportable politician.
Well, let me probe that farther a little bit, because like say there's a Mamdani supporter who genuinely does think that, okay, well, this is what New York needs, and they subjectively consider themselves a socialist and so on and so forth. How would we try and convince them that if Mamdani just ran as an independent, that's not really going to solve the problem? Like I'm just trying to yeah, probe this line of argumentation a bit farther.
Yeah, I mean, one thing is this question of independence from the Democratic Party is an important one. I think
Key, actually, isn't it?
It's like pretty important. Yeah, if you're going to like build a workers' party in this country. The question is like understanding that on a political level and not just like this organizational connection to the Democrats and like being on their ticket. I think the dynamic is one of really understanding that a liberal perspective that is seeking to provide a service to the ruling capitalist class by not taking them on or directing a movement against them is really the problem with his politics. Him being a Democrat, I think, is really an outgrowth of that perspective. Mm-hmm. The perspective, that the DSA shares of trying to use this party to do good things for working people. But what that means is not directing the struggle against the capitalist class. It means trying to look for reforms within that framework, which fighting for reforms isn't the problem. It's saying to the working masses and to, socialists and, young people, radicals, that you could achieve these things and it'll be all okay by not directing your fire against the real root of the problem.
Right. So whether Zohran is an independent or in the Democratic Party, so long as he's not actually taking on the material interests of the ruling class, that's going to be the obstacle for why he can't actually really defend New York or improve anything, or basically why he's not a step forward for New York. Would that be a way of summing up what you just said?
Yeah, I think the question is really that Zohran's program is one that not only does he not like seek to build a workers' party or to build a working class movement that's directed against the capitalist class, but it also that he can't actually win workers to such a perspective, and he doesn't have like a real, a basis to unite the working class. And in fact, on like really key issues of how you would forge working class unity in order to fight for, basic things related to affordability, is that you do need to take on, segregation, the deep problem in the city. You do need to take on all sorts of divisions, in particular political divisions in the working class, because, more and more, even in a, very Democratic Party dominated city like New York, look to Trump and to the right as the only people that are going to, really smash the status quo. And so, of course, Zohran is proposing to also change the status quo in a big way, but it's really in line with shoring up this same old party that has been the main enemy of any working class movement, whether it be for quality housing or transportation or anything.
Mm-hmm. Okay, what about the RCA? I already raised the RCA a little bit in terms of their understanding of what Mamdani represents, but they're one of the more left-wing orthodox sounding groups on the scene right now. What was their take in terms of Mamdani?
I mean, one thing I think that is important is that what the RCA have to say, and, similar to Left Voice and other left groups in that way, is that there is like a massive leftward tide of radicalism against the status quo, and that the situation is actually pretty good for the left and, pretty good for the working class, despite what we can see are like constant attacks, be it an ongoing genocide, military deployment in, Los Angeles or bombing of Iran. So what that means for the RCA is like that they see Zohran also as part of that leftward shift. And attribute him getting the Democratic Party nomination as part of like a radical anti-establishment movement. And so what they said is that Zohran, this is a quote, Zohran's massive core of 42,000 volunteers could have provided the nucleus of just such a working class party. He could have run as an independent socialist and called on these volunteers to sign party cards and get to work recruiting coworkers, friends, family, etc. So this is actually even a shift to the right for the RCA, unfortunately. Their initial article was titled Why Communists Can't Support Zohran. And then their second article after he won is titled, Is This a Step to a Socialist New York? So even within the left, we're seeing a shift to the right and really big illusions in Zohran in a way that is also an obstacle to building any kind of, channel for the working class to use actual effective means to fight to increase their quality of living, let alone beat back the offensive coming from the capitalists and coming from Trump. So I think that's like a pretty big deal in terms of like the political terrain has really shifted since Zohran has won the Democratic Party nomination. And there was, I think, obviously there's a lot of attention given to Iran and to Los Angeles and just like the Trump's attacks there. But then since Zohran has won, there's just like a real like jubilation in a way that is actually an obstacle to preparing the working class to defend itself and to use its own means and its own union muscle to defend itself and immigrants and others.
Mm-hmm.
They're attributing to Zohran a character of like, this is someone that's actually going to like defend us, when really he's an obstacle to doing what needs to be done and to defending workers and the oppressed. And one thing I'll also say is there was planned to be a national march on Washington organized by the Answer Coalition this Saturday, the 28th. And that was actually nixed. Like right after Zohran is the Democratic Party nomination for mayor. And the PSL, who are connected to the Answer Coalition, were very explicit in saying that this was actually like a step forward that Zohran received this nomination.
Like, how does this have implications for how the left sees kind of national politics and the struggle against the government right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the connection is really one of how Mamdani and his victory and the way that the left are looking to him is actually part of a rightward shift in a way that is only going to weaken the forces of the working class and the left. So, for instance, the position of the PSL and like why they canceled this march on Washington, which was supposed to be in opposition to the US bombing Iran, and they haven't unbombed Iran. So, but it was also tied to this like ecstasy over a supposed leftward shift that's taking place in this country that flies in the face of what's really going on. So what they said regarding the postponement was that, the people, quote, the people of the United States by a large majority oppose a new U.S. war in the Middle East, causing Trump to seek a rapid exit. And the reality is, okay, I mean, millions were mobilized for Palestine. And that did not stop the genocide, nor did it stop the U.S. arming and supporting and making possible this genocide. But what is happening, though, with that perspective, that there's this radical and leftward shift, is it actually is like demobilizing the movement for Palestine, the movement to defend Iran, in favor of putting hopes in, progressive Democratic Party politicians are seen as basically fighting the good fight within the Democrats. Actually, it's stopping the mobilization that's needed to build an authentically anti-imperialist movement. How could you fight for the interests of the working people at home in New York City or anywhere else in this country without having a perspective of fighting against, U.S. imperialist attacks, their support to Israel, support to the genocide in Palestine, and also their attacks and bombing in Iran? The separation of those things is something that is actually will only weaken the working class when it comes to fighting against how that repression will reverberate back home.
Yeah. What you said about the left, what it makes me really think, correct me if I'm wrong, but it gives me the sense that on the one hand, you have groups on the left who are building illusions that this is a step forward or could be a step forward, just not outright calling it what we're calling it, which is that this is a way to shore up the Democratic Party. Would you say that that's a correct way of summing up what the difference is between what we have to say about Mamdani and why, he's not actually a step forward for New York versus what other groups on the left are doing?
Yeah, I think that the role that the left has been actually to basically point to him as someone with like, revolutionary potential, but is actually helping shore up the Democratic Party. And so it's contradictory in that like the left, are still critical that he is a Democrat. And yet when it comes to the substance of his politics and what he's doing and how he is performing that service for the ruling class, they actually are supportive.
Right. I mean, and on the whole question of breaking through the two-party system, that's a huge question for going anywhere in the US in terms of advancing the interests of the working class, right? In terms of building a workers' party. That is a key question for the left. I want to start wrapping up this discussion because we've talked a lot about like, okay, what was this? What was wrong with this? And why is the left wrong? But if you could give our listeners a little bit of what kind of a broad programmatic framework do we have for fighting for a working class party in the country?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's pretty important to how to start from the perspective of fighting for a working class party, in particular in this country, is one of needing to really expose the trap of progressive Democrats. That's been one of the main tasks of communists in this country, going back to the way that FDR, was able to head off the formation of such a working class party through the New Deal and through instituting these social democratic measures that would head off that kind of political development. But going to now, like the way that Zohran is successfully being able to head off any contenders in the left for the working class, or just even these groups of people who were politicized by Bernie Sanders. And so I think that that's pretty important. And I think the other thing is really to have an orientation, to fight, to beat back the forces of reaction really requires having a perspective, I think, to how to build up the working class to be that force and how to make communist socialists a real force in that process, leading the working class to actually strengthen its forces and defend against reaction. And so, for instance, having a strategy to mobilize the unions and use their actual social power in the workplace to defend, immigrants in their own workplaces. And, if ICE were to snatch them, that they actually use their real power to do that, as opposed to putting their stocks and hopes in someone like Zohran, who talks about his experience being an immigrant and that he wants New York City to remain like a sanctuary city. But, the reality is, doesn't have any kind of intention of mobilizing the working class against the capitalists that he's, trying to actually represent. So that's one thing. Another is that really the working class should be the spearhead of the movement against segregation as part of a key part of a strategy to fight for quality housing. That there's actually, and a lot of this goes to what perspective do you take also in terms of wanting the left to be a real force in the working class and actually vying for leadership in that. And really the obstacle to those things is the workers associate with the Democratic Party and with liberalism enemies, people who guilt trip and who, attack them for, being backward or supporting conservative right-wing politicians. But the reality is that, that is fueled by a hatred of the status quo and how what the status quo even has to offer the working class has deteriorated along with, right, what the situation of the American empire more broadly. I think Zohran is, we've talked about that's really a concrete thing that the left would need to take up and actually expose as an obstacle, as opposed to building up his credentials. And so one thing that I think is important for us trying to build such a party and, in a sea of leftists that are trying to do the same thing is to actually debate what needs to be done, in particular, not just in this election, but also in general about this political evolution that the Democrats are undergoing in order to swindle the working class and to swindle young leftists. So that's pretty important. And I think we should seek to debate with people who both are building up his credentials and, see Zohran as maybe not that bad or a step in the right direction, as well as people and left groups that have really sought not to really say anything about him and who just talk about revolution in the abstract. I think we want to be able to debate with both of those parts of the left.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Well, I think I've basically run out of questions in terms of currently what's happening in New York, what the coming days will reveal. That's another question. But for now, that's all I've got. Is there anything else that you wanted to add?
I think that we definitely are interested in engaging with other left groups and their opinions and about Zohran wanting to mobilize jointly in anti-imperialist contingents against the depredations of the US, against attacks at home and abroad, because that's only going to increase. And in the process of that, debate what path forward, in particular around what to do about the Democrats' new rebranding that Zohran is really central to. And so I think we really want to engage with, Zohran supporters, with the left, with just in general the working class, and, to that aim of both common work and also like engagement over political differences.
Cool. And I'll just once again mention that the key article that we wrote following Trump 2.0, Where's the US Going? It really does give our understanding of, the political dynamics in the United States right now. And the current article on Mamdani, as well as the DSA, they're in the current issue of the paper, Workers Vanguard. I'll link them in the show notes. Do follow Workers Vanguard on X and Instagram at Workers Vanguard. And I think that's about it.
And take a look at our Zohran cartoon.
Right, yeah. Shout out to Gabe, who made that. Very funny cartoon, I must say.
Yeah.
Do you want to just explain what that cartoon was?
I mean, it's basically Zohran, who is sitting on the symbol of the DNC, which is the blue donkey with the money bags, because it's the party of Wall Street. And then the DSA is just pointing at him, because Zohran's saying, it's basically a quote from him. We're saying, like, let the NYPD do their jobs. Mm-hmm. And then the DSAers are ecstatic that he's going, like, this is a guy who's going to fight the establishment, Yeah. So it's a very cute little encapsulation of the dynamic we're dealing with.
Okay, lovely. Okay. On that note, thank you, Brianna, for coming to explain all of that to us and our listeners.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay. See you later. Bye.
Bye.